So welcome NCYM people, children's ministers, youth ministers to our video cast, whatever they call it, deal. We just wanted to try to do something monthly to give you guys some help and some things to think about. This week, we've got Shannon Rains from Lubbock, Ron Bruner from Hollis, Oklahoma, at the Westview Boys Home, and Jennifer at another one of those schools somewhere way out from Abilene Christian. And then yours truly from Oklahoma Christian here. So Shannon, let me turn it over to you, get into our topic, and let's take it and run.
Okay. Well, at our conference this year, we had several speakers that talked about intergenerational spiritual formation. Especially Robbie Castleman really connected with a lot of you as she talked about worshiping with children and having our children, helping our parents know how to have our children in the auditorium. And I heard quite a few of the different children's ministers talk about how much they would love to see that happen at their congregation. And that would mean ending children's worship, which is loved dearly by some of their members. And so they were starting to kind of struggle with, if this is a good vision to have intergenerational worship, then what does that look like to maybe transition? Or maybe even a little bit of my concern was thinking about, should they transition? At what point do they know it's a good time to transition? Because what is theologically appropriate is not always something we need to jump in with both feet because of other issues within our congregation. So I was telling Dudley about that, and he said, let's get together and have a chat about that. So I guess with that in mind, Ron, Jennifer, whichever one of you might want to jump in first with thoughts. What would you tell these ministers that are probably listening that are trying to now decide, do we jump in with both feet with intergenerational worship or do we transition somehow? What do you think?
I have a couple of observations to get us started, and that is, first of all theology is contextual. What is appropriate depends on where you were at and what time you're at that place. And so we always want to remember that. And we also want to remember, too, that just because I have a theology, it doesn't mean that the entire community is going to accept that particular theology. I may have to be persuasive about making the case that it's the best theology. And so the other thing I would say is that when you're talking about changing from children's worship that's separate to bringing children in among the congregation, which is something I very much believe in, you're talking about a change of culture. You do not change the culture of a community quickly. I've been at Westview Boys Home for 23 years. It took me 3 years to get the initial cultural changes made that I wanted to make. It took me 10 years to get the biggest ones made. And so just remember that if you want this, you need to have a plan for the long haul and not think that by this time next year, you're going to have kids sitting in the pews with you, because that will most probably result in something other than what you expected, because you want to be in the pews with the kids too. So figure out what I just said.
It sounds like you're throwing us a warning. Just to be clear, you're giving us a warning.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, and I hate to say just ditto to what Ron said, but really ditto contextually, and I agree. I affirm my stance on the importance of intergenerationality. I think it's hugely important. I think it's incredibly beneficial, but I also have worked in churches where it may not have been the right move for that point in time. So you've got to look about what's going on around you. What are the needs of the congregation, and where do you need to really dive in fully into making those changes, because it is going to be a long-term change. And the thing we often have to remember is, and this is where I think churches sometimes can miss the boat, is that we imagine bringing kids into worship is the same thing as intergenerationality. And instead, actual intergenerational worship is substantially more complex. It's not easy to do and to do well. And so it really takes a team approach. It takes a team approach, not just from the children's minister, but from the pulpit minister, from the worship minister, from all of the people in leadership who have a voice in shaping what worship looks like. Because simply setting a child in the proximity of adults, while there is some modeling that occurs that is formative and is helpful, is not the same thing as intergenerational worship. And so note that it can't happen quickly. It doesn't happen quickly. It is a long-term shift. I would encourage, maybe if this is a goal you have, to find some moments, and it's not something your church is doing, to find some moments and to find some elements and opportunities to engage intentionally in this way and start helping your congregation see the beauty and the inclusivity and the benefits that come out of these moments of spiritual formation, these intentional moments of spiritual formation.
Yeah. Dudley, did you want to jump in? You look like you had a question.
No, I agree. And I think, we've seen it in youth ministry where youth ministers have jumped in trying to change a whole church to make everybody be a youth minister kind of thing, and it backfires. And as Ron says, they're not sitting in that pew the next week. They're somewhere else. So I like the idea of taking time. And I also think, as much as I would like to think about throwing children in the quote worship service, that's probably one of the worst things we do in the sense of, why would I want my kids to be in that versus we could do intergenerational ministry in other contexts that probably we haven't even talked about.
Yeah, no, I'm thankful that you brought in kind of that youth ministry perspective here too, because as y'all were saying, this is a team effort. We all need to be headed on this path together if we're going to make it. From my own experience, I am guilty of seeing a good idea. And I grew up in a very small church. And so I grew up with intergenerational worship. I didn't know there was such a thing as children's worship. And so that was already foreign to me when I became a children's minister, that we would send people off someplace else. We were all part of the family. And so it was easy for me to want to recapture this thing I grew up in. But that want to, and then understanding that context that I was actually serving in was a big disconnect. And so for me, that's part of my ministry story, and learning to grow in my leadership skills was probably jumping the gun a few times on intergenerational worship and letting go of our nursery and our children's worships at different times when I thought the vision was clear, but the vision wasn't clear for that. And I think that's what you guys are doing a great job articulating, is what does a clear vision of this looks like and how long it takes to get clarity on that vision. Ron?
I think it's complicated because what you just brought up was a little bit of nostalgia, right?
Mm-hmm.
We all have our nostalgia about the way it was and how we think that is either good or bad. And sometimes other people's memories of their childhood experiences sitting in the pews is not as pleasant. And so therefore they project that onto their kids, and they imagine their kids would have the same experience if they're sitting in those pews. And what we need to be, first of all, aware of it, we need to change the experience to where they can see that it's possible for their kids to be in the pews and it not to be a negative experience. And also we need to understand, as Dr. Catherine Spiller said in her recent work, that embrace is more than being present, it's participation.
Well, and that's the note that I just wrote down, is the other element of this is if we're talking about this, especially from the idea of a worship standpoint, is, are we communicating to our children that they belong, that they are welcome, that they are an active part of what is occurring, that are they actively participating, and not just, are we making space for them to sit there, but are we welcoming their voices and their perspectives and all of their being into the conversation as well? Are we seeing them lead? Are we seeing them participate in ways that is incredibly meaningful? Because we know the impact that belonging has on spiritual formation as well.
Yeah, and I think, getting back to the dangers of just jumping in and doing something without thinking, the idea of being inclusive in that which obviously rubs against our fellowship, is that females are left out. If you get into that room where it is the worship place, you couldn't include females in that, and we miss that whole spiritual formation of them. So it's amazing that you can go next door in the gym and everybody can do everything. And so maybe thinking about how we set up those places of context where people can, everybody can be included, I think is critical.
Yeah, sure. We could provide a space that you can worship intergenerationally and not have to claim the Sunday morning space at first to transition into and set some expectations. I think anecdotally, as I've done the research on the women's stuff that I've done, one of the things we see with our churches is that women that or churches that choose greater inclusion for women, it seems like are choosing greater inclusion for children pretty quickly after, because they're having to already rethink about how they've been doing things. But that's not the direction all churches need to go. But I think all churches do need to find a way for all voices to be included in some space and welcomed in a space. I want them to be welcomed anytime the church is called together. That's not always the same. It's not always the possibility that we have before us. But so what baby steps? I think that's what I'm trying to come around to is, if we were going to take a baby step or two to start heading us in that direction, what baby steps would you recommend?
Mine kind of starts with this idea of equipping church leaders, your elders, your ministers, to understand what this could look like, to start getting a view of your vision for this, why it's important, what it can do. But really, all of the people who have a strong voice, who can speak for and champion and advocate for this, I think need to start walking along on this journey to understand what this can look like and why it's important.
Good. Ron?
I think that you have parents who need to be persuaded that worship, that God interacts with their children in ways that they may not even understand. And so they may be misperceiving what's happening in that pew. And I also think that we have gatekeepers in the pews who want children to behave in certain very circumspect ways that is not welcoming to children. We need to persuade them that having that energy and activity in the pew is essential to being a live community.
Yeah, very much so. You know, a couple of Sundays ago at church, we had this little girl, she's probably 3 or 4, and it was time to release the kiddos to children's worship. And when they go out, they all give our preacher and our worship leaders high fives as they go out. And this little girl just makes a kind of a V or U-turn, whatever, and goes straight up on the stage and takes her place up on stage like she just belongs there. Like this is the next thing that she needs to do in her day, is whatever she had in mind. I'm guessing she had in mind that she was going to go up on the stage and preach, but we don't know if she's 3. But that's the time period that it is. And while we could have looked at that and thought, oh my goodness, how disruptive, there was something beautiful about that moment and about the way it showed us that this little girl saw her place as part of that community. She wanted to explore another space of that community that maybe wasn't the best time, but most of us just watched her in awe and just thought, how did it feel to be her? To come in, can we remember that time that we would come into worship and we just did maybe whatever God was prompting us to do in that moment? It was a blessing to my day. Some would look at that moment and say disruptive. It's not a blessing. To me, it was a huge blessing in my day to see that child just be so fully present in the moment. As we also kind of scooted her towards the door for children's worship. It was fun watching all the adults also try to decide, how do we help her move along in a joyful way without falling apart? But Dudley, what are you thinking?
Ron and Jen, was there ever a time before Jesus, obviously walking in the wilderness, everybody was together, and then when Jesus comes along, they try to get the children out of his way? But was there a time in our fellowship particular where we were doing, quote, intergenerational, we probably didn't know what it was, but everybody was together, and then something happened that said, okay, wait a minute, children go here, teens go over here, and the adults are here. You guys, is there any history back there that we could go back and say, hey, here's how it might have been and why it was good or why we quit doing it?
I don't know for certain. My guess is like the emergence of youth ministries and children's ministries in churches of Christ, that children's worship was a copying of what happened in other faith families. And so we saw some other faith group do it, and somebody said, well, that's a really good idea. That'll fix our problem. Or that, and the most likely one is this, that will attract more young parents. And so the practice was instituted, and it acquired its own momentum, its own history, and eventually its own nostalgia, to where it, in some congregations, is the third rail. You don't want to touch it. And so what we've got to do is take the power out of that third rail on this thing and be able to have the conversation that talks about what's best for our kids and how can we disconnect that from short-term evangelistic efforts to long-term spiritual formative efforts that would be better for keeping the church potent, strong, present in this world.
Jen?
That's exactly what I was going to say. Really, I feel like it came out of that desire to attract young families. I think it somewhat also comes out of this age-appropriate idea. What is age-appropriate for this grouping or this grouping? And so I think that is some of also where it came out of. I recently spoke with a church that COVID was very difficult for them, and they came out on the other side a very different church than what they went into. But in coming out a very different church, they just essentially, they were much smaller. They didn't have the number of people that they had originally had. They didn't have the space or the manpower for programs. And so they just came out of it going, okay, well, here's who we're going to be. We're going to be an intergenerational church. And because they were essentially reimagining themselves, they weren't held to many of those same practices, that sense of nostalgia. They were both, as a byproduct of a great deal of church fracturing, able to just determine, well, here's who we're going to be, and here's how we're going to operate, and here's what our vision is going to be. But most churches don't have that luxury, because it is difficult, as Ron said, to disconnect these short-term evangelistic goals from what long-term spiritual formation actually looks like.
You brought up something there. You used the word resources. I think often leaders don't realize what a huge expenditure of resources that a separate children's worship is, and how that necessarily affects the way that children's ministry is done and how volunteers are used within the scope of that ministry. So if you're having a hard time finding Bible class teachers on Sunday morning and you have a children's worship program, you really have a conflict on how resources are used in your congregation that needs resolution. And you need to decide what's a better use of resources. And so I think that's one of the practical arguments that can be made with leadership in terms of trying to change the culture of this thing, if that's your objective, is what's a good use of the resources that this congregation has.
Yeah, and I think as a children, oh, can I jump in real quick?
Jump in.
Okay.
And wrap
I think
up.
as a children, okay, I will do both. I think as children's ministry leaders, we get to see the big picture. And so sometimes when we're making these decisions and we want to see a change, like maybe going from children's worship to intergenerational worship, because we see all these pieces and how together, it feels like it's an easy choice to go one direction or the other. Resources, Ron does it for me every time. I'm an Excel spreadsheet type of person. You put that on paper and I say, we don't have the resources. There's a choice to be made here. But we have to remember, part of change in our congregation is bringing along others and helping them see those same things that we get to see. That's part of the big picture. So I'm glad that you brought that up. Also, we talked some about baby steps for just a second. Next time we record a video, see, I'm wrapping up, Dudley. Next time we record a video, Holly Allen's going to join us, and she's going to talk about intergenerational Christian formation, which is the book that she wrote. But she's coming out with a second edition. That's going to be published here pretty soon. So she's going to join us and talk to us some about that, and maybe even if she's changed some things in the editions, I don't know. But she'll be able to catch us up to speed and let us know what all she's learned in this period of time with this book being available to church leaders. So thank you for joining us.